She was 20 years old and, for all practical purposes, homeless. 3 days earlier her uncle had informed her, across the long desk of his study, that his house was no longer her house. And the reason was not cruelty but a wedding in June and a young man in his accounting office who had agreed to marry his daughter and move into the second bedroom. The whole affair resolvable on a single page of a ledger book of profit and loss. What nobody knew, walking past her that morning on the bus station's slatted bench with everything she owned in a brown grocery bag, was that the small brass engineer's compass warming in her coat pocket had been her father's, and that on the inside of its lid, in his cramped machinist's hand, he had inscribed one sentence she could recite with her eyes closed: measure twice, the sea forgives nothing. That sentence was why, on the previous Friday, she had walked into a branch of the First Pacific Trust and mailed a cashier's check for $1,873, every cent the Pacific County back tax bill demanded, to the county clerk of Gray Harbor, Oregon, against an asset no living soul in 3 counties had wanted, a 312-foot diesel-electric attack submarine, the USS Heron. That had vanished from the Navy's ledgers in a Pacific storm in February of 1965, had sunk, had been raised, had been beached, and had sat on the shale outside the dying mill town of Gray Harbor for 6 years accumulating fines and dust. Settle in, friends, and tell me where you're listening from, because the story you're about to hear is the story of one Vivian Adelaide Marsh, the wreck she bought on her 20th birthday. And the quiet, dust-covered thing the wreck was hiding, not a body, not a torpedo, not a code, but an answer to a question her father, machinist's mate first class, had left unfinished in 1963. Vivian Marsh had been raised between 2 worlds, neither of which could admit the other existed. The first world was the small framed house on Seaview Avenue in Bremerton, Washington, where her father, Arthur Marsh, had come home each evening smelling of hydraulic oil, diesel soap, and the sweet metallic tang of cut brass, his hands still black under the nails from the drydock at the Navy Yard. He was a submarine machinist's mate, first class, and he had worked on the boats of Submarine Squadron 6 for 19 years, the Pickerel, the Stickle, the Trepang, and finally, in the last months before he died, the Heron. He had taught Vivian to read a drafting square before she could ride a bicycle. He had let her sand a tiny brass clevis under his bench lamp at the age of 7, and she remembered, 60 years later she would remember. The precise hiss of sandpaper on metal and how her father's voice went low and slow when he explained a thing, *You see this seam? That seam is the boat. That seam is the difference between a boat that comes home and a boat that doesn't. He had died at 42, in a fall from the forward saddle tank of a moored training boat, the coroner said. Frayed safety line, no witnesses, a long way down. He had left her the compass. He had left her, also, one short phrase. Her mother had died 3 years later, quietly, of something the doctor called the consumption and her uncle Calvin called a mercy, on a Tuesday morning in October while Vivian was at school. From her mother, Ruth Marsh, Vivian remembered almost nothing except a scent, lily of the valley, the small white soap wrapped in silver paper, and one soft gesture, a hand on the forehead. A palm cool against the skin. That was all. After her mother's funeral, her mother's brother, Calvin Whitlock, had taken her in. Calvin was the manager of a savings and loan in Bremerton and lived with his wife Dolores and their daughter Patricia in a split level on the better side of town. Calvin was not unkind, he was something more precise than unkind, which was a man who believed that every human relationship reduced at last to a debit and a credit. And that the business of raising a niece was, like any other business, an item to be settled and closed. He had given Vivian her own bedroom, a small one behind the kitchen, and he had paid for her schooling and her lunches and her one good coat each winter, and he had shown her, in his own way, the elegant logic of a machine that did not need to forgive anything because it never forgot anything. Vivian, who had been 7, and then 11, and then 15, and then 20, had sat at his kitchen table and learned his grammar by day. By night, in the small bedroom behind the kitchen, with a flashlight propped against her pillow, she had read her father's drafting manuals and the Navy's 1958 edition of Bureau of Ship Submarine Piping Diagrams. Until the elegant logic of a machine in one book and the elegant logic of a ledger in the other became, in her strange and stubborn mind, the same logic. And she could hold both worlds in her two hands the way a draftsman holds a T-square and a pencil. The notice came on a Wednesday in March, 8 years after she had come to live with him, and the reason was a wedding and a hire, the two events being connected only by the date. Patricia Whitlock, Calvin's daughter, was to be married in June to a young man named Glenn Asher, who had been hired in February as a junior loan officer at the Savings and Loan and had, by March, been moved into the second bedroom of the Whitlock house as a kind of probationary period before the wedding. Calvin called Vivian into the study on a Wednesday evening. He was at his desk. He did not ask her to sit. "Vivian," he said, and he did not look up from the page he was signing. "I want to talk to you about arrangements for the summer. Patricia and Glenn will be needing the back bedroom after the wedding, and Dolores feels the back bedroom is not appropriate for them as it stands, so we will be converting it. I have decided, after some thought, that this is the right moment for you to make arrangements of your own. You are 20. You are capable. I have set aside a check for $1,873, which is a fair sum, generous by any ordinary accounting, and which I am prepared to place in your hands this Friday. The matter is settled." He folded the letter he had been signing into thirds, slid it across the blotter into his out tray, and looked up at her then, for the first time, briefly. His eyes, behind his rimless glasses, did not waver. He had done the arithmetic and the arithmetic was finished, and there was nothing in his face that resembled malice or regret. There was the neat satisfaction of a man who had closed a ledger, and closed it cleanly, and who did not need anything further from her. Vivian did not plead. She did not argue. She stood very still for what felt like a long minute, and then she said, "Thank you, Uncle Calvin. I will be packed by Friday." She had not, in fact, packed by Friday, she had packed by Thursday, because the small bedroom behind the kitchen held only a few humble things. And she had wanted to be gone before Dolores had to come in and sweep it. The things she packed were, a single wool blanket, folded twice, a tin of her father's drafting pencils, 2 cotton shirts, 1 flannel, 1 pair of good trousers. A paperback copy of Bureau of Ship Submarine piping diagrams, a small brown envelope containing her birth certificate and her high school diploma, and, in the inside breast pocket of her good coat, the brass compass in its leather case. There was one small, unmentioned absence she noticed when she closed her suitcase on Thursday afternoon. The framed school photograph of herself that had hung on the back bedroom wall for 7 autumns was gone from the wall, moved at some point she could not date to a closet in the hall, and Patricia, she realized, had not even been aware of having moved it. The brass compass against her ribs as she walked down Seaview Avenue that Thursday evening felt heavier than it had in her father's hand, and she pressed it once, lightly, against the bone. And walked on. She took a Greyhound bus out of Bremerton at 6:12 on the morning of her 20th birthday, March the 19th of 1978. The bus was a 1966 MCI Cruiser, the seats blue vinyl with a tear in the third row patched with electrician's tape, the radiator under the floor ticking, the overhead light flickering on at every bump. There were 9 other passengers in the first stretch, an elderly couple smelling of mothballs and cocoa butter, a young conscript in olive coveralls whose breath smelled of milk and cores, a woman with a rosary and a sleeping infant, and a man in a feed store jacket who talked, to no one in particular, about the price of alfalfa. Vivian sat by the window, the brown grocery bag on her lap, and watched the firs drop away behind Salem and the Cascades rise ahead of her like a folded napkin. The bus changed at Portland for a smaller scenic cruiser that smelled of diesel and old coffee, and again at Astoria, where she waited 40 minutes on a bench and ate 1/3 of a Hershey bar. Careful to leave the rest, and at last struck out south on Highway 30 along the Columbia, until the highway tipped away from the river and bent west on a road the map called, in small italic letters, the Gray Harbor Spit. She had booked the ticket 2 weeks earlier with what was left of her uncle's check after she had set aside the back tax sum. And what was left after the ticket was $113, in 5s and 1s, and a stray quarter with a 1964 mint mark. She kept the quarter separate, in her pocket, on principle. She had, on the previous Friday, mailed a separate cashier's check, $1,873, to the Pacific County Tax Office. As instructed by the 4-line notice she had found pinned to a corkboard at the Astoria Greyhound station under a single straight pin, * Pacific County Tax Sale. March 23, 1978. 10 a.m. County Clerk's Office, Gray Harbor. Item 7, 1, former U.S. naval vessel, diesel electric, 312 feet, beached shale, Gray Harbor Spit, Oregon. Back taxes owed, $1,873. Sealed bids accepted, * she had read the notice twice that day at the bus station. She had reread it on the bus. She had not, in any of these readings, doubted it. The principal was her father's and her uncle's combined, and it was this, a thing whose worth everyone had agreed was nil was not, for that reason, worthless, it was, for that reason, available. And the test of a person was not whether they could see what a thing was, but whether they could see what a thing could be made. One cannot truly lose, Arthur Marsh had written once on the back of an old pay envelope, in his cramped hand. What one never possessed, she had carried the envelope for 15 years in a pocket of her drafting case, and she carried it still, folded into the lining of her coat. Gray Harbor, Oregon, was the kind of town that had been laid down for a purpose and had outlived its purpose by 30 years. It had been built around a cedar mill in 1923, and the cedar mill had burned in 1948 and had been rebuilt and had burned again in 1961 and had not been rebuilt. What remained was a low grid of false-fronted concrete storefronts along a single street, 2 cafes, a hardware store. A single-screen movie theater showing the further adventures of the Wilderness family on a loop, a library with a hand-lettered banner that read free books, take what you need. A Coast Guard station with the flag at half-mast for reasons no one living could recall, and a post office that had shortened its own hours to 4 mornings a week. The river for which the town had been named had been diverted in 1958 for a federal flood control project, and its bed was a long white scar of gravel visible from anywhere in town. The shrubs along the gravel had grown tall as a man, and the wind in them sounded like paper. The population, according to the single hand-painted sign at the town limits, was 312. The actual population, the waitress at the diner told Vivian, was closer to 219 if you didn't count the dogs. And there, on the shale spit west of town, at the foot of the empty riverbed, half in and half out of the Pacific tide, was the heron. She was 312 feet long, 27 feet across the beam, and rose 28 feet out of the shale at the bow, falling to 22 at the stern as the sand had settled under her aft ballast tanks. The salt spray had stripped her sail, the streamlined fairwater above the conning tower, to a dull bone gray, and the rest of her hull plating, the light outer hull, not the pressure hull within, was freckled with rust that had run, in long vertical streaks, the color of dried blood. There was a stripe of dried seaweed at the waterline and a single tattered U.S. Navy ensign on a flagpole that had no flag. There was no other large object in Gray Harbor within 3 miles of her. There was no building in town within 3 miles of her. She was, viewed from the highway bridge at the edge of town, 260,000 pounds of riveted steel, lifted out of the sea and laid down on a beach as casually as a child lays down a toy boat in a bathtub, and she was absurd, and magnificent, and utterly abandoned. Vivian Marsh stepped off the bus, shouldered her grocery bag, looked at the heron across 3 flat miles of salt meadow, and felt something in her chest, not pity, not fear, but a kind of recognition, as if she had been a forgotten ledger entry all her life and had at last, on this beach, found a 10-digit code that matched her own. The Pacific County Clerk's office occupied the back half of a Quonset hut 2 blocks south of the diner. The clerk was a man of 51 named Wendell Pace, who had been appointed in 1974 and who read paperback westerns behind his desk between customers. He was dry, polite, faintly incredulous. "The Submarine," he said, and he looked up from his carbon paper invoice and then back down. "Ma'am, you're here for the Submarine," Vivian said she was. Wendell Pace removed his reading glasses, set them on the desk, and looked at her over the rims. "I'm required," he said, to inform you that this vessel has been offered to the county in lieu of back taxes on the same parcel 4 times running, 1974, 1975, 1976. 1977, and that no responsible party has tendered a bid. The current back taxes, penalties, and recording fees, as of this morning, total $1,873 exactly. Which is the same amount that's been on the file since 1974 because the county doesn't usually bother to re-add the penalties after the first year. The vessel is known locally, he added, and the corner of his mouth twitched, as the Heron, or the Folly, depending on who you ask. Most people who live out here call it the Folly, he paused. You have a cashier's check for the full amount, she did. He accepted it, sighed once, and stamped her a receipt in duplicate, the carbon paper catching on a small spring clip at the corner of his desk, the ink smelling of iron gall and ribbon oil. He handed her a stiff cream-colored carbon copy deed, recorded in longhand, and a tatty manila folder containing the previous 3 years of tax filings and 1 photograph, in glossy black and white. Of the Heron underway in 1962, the deck awash in white spray, the ensign at full stretch, the conning tower like the rim of a hat. He wished her, with the smallest shrug she had ever been witness to, better luck than the last 3 bidders, ma'am. Who all thought briefly they were going to do something with her and then went home and didn't. Vivian walked out of the Quonset hut with the manila folder in her grocery bag. The receipt in her coat pocket against the compass, and walked the 3 miles to the beach road. The forward escape hatch of the Heron was set in the top of the sail, 10 feet above the shale and accessible by a welded ladder that still held despite the salt. Vivian climbed the ladder, set the bottom of her grocery bag on the deck plate outside the hatch, and turned the brass dogging wheel of the watertight hatch through 36 full turns until the dogs were retracted and the hatch cover swung upward on its counterweight hinge with a long slow groan of metal that sounded to her ears like a chord. The stale air that came down out of the hatch was cold, mineral, faintly sweet, the way an old sea cave smells, the way a bottle of iodine smells. And it carried with it a fine dust that fell in a slow sheet onto her sleeve. She swung down the inside ladder and stepped, in her good shoes, onto the teak grating of the control room flat. The boat was 312 feet long. She explored it room by room over the next 6 hours, and she did it the way her father had taught her to read a piping diagram, in order, fore to aft. The forward torpedo room, the bunks, the mess, the control room, the maneuvering room, the main engines, for giant General Motors diesels, Model 16-278A, each the size of a small truck. Painted the Navy's pale wartime green and laid up on their lead-lined bedplates and crusted in a thin skin of salt, the after torpedo room, the crew's berths, the auxiliary room, the radio shack, the capacitor bank. She kicked her way through dust that lay thick as a blanket on every flat surface, 3 inches of it on the control panel tops, an inch of it on the deck gratings. The dust itself pale gray-brown and smelling of old oil and dry rot, of the slow oxidation of copper. The boat smelled, in every compartment, the same. She carried that smell out with her on her clothes for the rest of the spring. In the maneuvering room, in the after third, she knelt and laid her ear to the deck plate above the port main engine, and she tapped the plate, twice, with the brass stylus of her drafting pencil. And listened. The plate rang true. The sound was clean and applewood bright, never dull, never glassy, and even through the rust and the corrosion she could feel, in the bones of her hand, the geometry of the engine below. Bolted to her bedplate, tied by 4 long through bolts to the hull girder, the crankshaft still on center, the bearings still seated. The pressure hull, the inner hull, the hull that actually kept the sea out, was fundamentally sound. The lead-lined ballast tanks were fundamentally sound. The bronze sea valves, when she had worked 3 of them loose by hand and sniffed them open for half a second, were fundamentally sound. She stood up in the maneuvering room and looked aft, into the dim, and she made a small sound in her throat that she did not, at the moment, recognize as a laugh. "It's a home," she said, out loud, to no one, and her voice carried strangely down the long compartment. "It's a home, just waiting to be awakened." She moved into the chief petty officer's stateroom on the second day, a small 10x8 compartment with 2 bunks and a fold-down desk. She pulled the door shut against the wind and set the brown grocery bag on the lower bunk and began, that evening, the long and methodical business of bringing a 312-foot warship back into the world. One room at a time. The first thing she did was sweep the dust. She had no broom. She had, in her grocery bag, a small whisk she'd brought from home, a tin cup, half a tin of her father's drafting pencils, a paper of straight pins, and a clean handkerchief. She used the whisk for the first 3 mornings and then walked the 7 miles into town with the instruction, sliding the receipt across the counter of the hardware store, of buying for cash. With no credit, no delivery, and no help, a single push broom, a roll of butcher's twine, and a half-pound can of naval-grade gray paint. The hardware man, whose name was Earl Haskins, asked her once, briefly, what she meant to do with a broom if she lived on a submarine, and Vivian had replied, briefly, "Sweep it," and Earl Haskins had not asked again. The first weeks were measured in small, methodical victories. Day 4, she swept the control room flat clear to bare metal. Day 9, she pried one of the 2-inch thick lucite deadlights out of its brass frame and cleaned it with salt water and a rag, and the deadlight let in, for the first time in a decade, a clean shaft of Pacific morning light that fell across the plotting board with the dust in it like motes of gold. Day 14, she wired a single drop cord from the auxiliary generator terminus in the auxiliary room up to the control room and rigged, into the end of the cord, a 50-watt bulb. The bulb came on. It was a small, slightly yellow, slightly orange light. It was the first electric light on the Heron since the boat had been raised. The first evening she sat under it, drinking hot water from a tin cup with a 1/4 teaspoon of dried milk in it, she felt she had lit, in the middle of a dead river, a small pocket of civilization. She rationed kerosene for the small folding stove she had carried, and bread from Marlene Dossett's bakery on the main street, and tin milk. And slept under her wool blanket on the lower bunk of the chief's stateroom for 42 nights before the night she stopped hearing the wind at the hull plating and started, instead, hearing the slow tick of the brass compass on the folded handkerchief on the desk above her, which was the sound of a clock that was correct. On the 43rd night, she tried the door of the commanding officer's sea cabin. The sea cabin was the boat's most private space, a small compartment amidships, just forward of the control room, separated from it by a watertight door with a brass dogging wheel that had been, since 1965, painted over and welded over by an unknown hand with a rough pass of beige marine epoxy, the epoxy laid over the seam of the wheel and into the dogging slots. The door itself was sound, the wheel turned freely within its epoxy prison. She tried her father's drafting technique first. She sat cross-legged on the deck with the seam of the wheel under her knees and worked, with the brass stylus and a single sewing needle from her paper of straight pins, at the epoxy, scratching at it line by line for 2 hours. It would not give. The epoxy was not paint, and a stylus was not the right tool, and at the end of the 2 hours she had a sore thumb and a half-inch scratch in the epoxy, and no progress. She took a different approach on the 44th night. She walked into town at dawn, bought, for cash, at the hardware store, a single 18-inch flat pry bar and a short cold chisel, and walked back to the boat. She worked, kneeling, for 6 hours and 40 minutes. She set the chisel at the seam of the wheel hub. She struck it once, lightly, with the heel of her palm, and listened to the epoxy crack. She struck it again. She struck it 12 times, total. The epoxy spider-webbed around the hub and flaked off in pale slivers that landed in her lap, and at the end of the 12th strike the brass wheel rotated 1/8 of a turn freely under her hand. And she rotated it the rest of the way, 36 turns, until the dogs retracted. The door, which had been sealed since 1965, swung inward on its hinge with the cold, mineral exhalation of a sealed compartment, and a slow, smooth, undisturbed layer of dust rolled out into the control room. The air inside was a different temperature from the air in the control room, it was colder, it smelled faintly of paper and of tobacco, it smelled faintly of a man. The sea cabin was a small, square room, 8 feet by 8, paneled in varnished teak, with a single brass deadlight high in the forward bulkhead, a settee with a green baize coverlet. A fold-down desk with a leather top, a brass lamp with a green glass shade, and a small framed photograph of a woman and a boy in summer clothes, the glass unbroken. On the desk, undisturbed in 13 years, was a heavy blue-gray logbook, the cover stamped in gilt with the boat's name and hull number, and a small wooden humidor in which 3 cigars lay. Still banded, still fragrant with the ghost of Cuban tobacco. The logbook was the commanding officer's official war diary, and the first page identified him by name and date, * Lieutenant Commander Elmer R. Voss, USN, commanding, USS Heron, SS 451, from 11 February 1959 to 14 October 1965, * the entries, in a small, careful naval hand, were the standard right-hand margin prose of a boat log, very short. 2 or 3 lines minimum, 6 maximum, dated to the day, and they told a story Vivian Marsh read in 3 sittings. The early entries were routine, the working prose of a man running a quiet patrol boat in the early Cold War, dives on the clock, port calls, refits. The middle entries, starting in late 1962, drifted in their tone, as if the man writing them had begun to speak to the boat itself rather than to his relief. The boat was aging out. The Navy was contracting. Trepang refit cancelled. Pickerel decommissioned YAG. Shore duty promised, postponed. Wife took the boy to her mother's in Portland. The entries became shorter, more clipped. On March 7, 1965, one entry ran to 6 lines and ended with the phrase, "I have decided that I am done fighting it and that I will stay." On October 7, 1965, the final entry, it ran to a single line. In the same hand, but with the letters slightly widened, as if the hand had begun, at last, to shake, * I cannot, in conscience, leave her. She is sound. Someone will value her. I have arranged the rest, * Vivian closed the book. She set her hand flat on the cover and listened to her own breathing and the wind in the sail outside. She looked up. She looked at the fold-down desk. She tapped the desk lightly along its forward edge with the brass stylus of her drafting pencil, 10 taps, equally spaced, listening to the wood at each tap. The first 9 taps rang clean. The 10th tap, 3 inches to the right, rang hollow. She leaned down and pressed the spot with her thumb. A small panel in the rosewood, 4 inches by 9, swung inward on a concealed hinge, with a small dry click, and revealed a shallow drawer. In the drawer lay, in order, the following objects, undisturbed. A single thick envelope, cream-colored, sealed with a smear of red wax, addressed in the same careful naval hand to the finder. A second envelope, smaller, unsealed, containing 13 U.S. Treasury notes, each of $100, in sequential serial numbers from a Portland bank. And a small wooden box, the box about the size of a cigarette case, containing, on a small square of black velvet, the gold wedding ring of a man named Elmer R. Voss, and a folded square of paper on which the same hand had inscribed the names of 2 people, Margaret, and the boy. The cream-colored envelope, when she broke the wax with her thumbnail, contained 4 pages, all written in the same careful naval hand, the lines even, the letters evenly spaced, the paper gray-white with 13 years of patient waiting. The first page read, * to whomever finds this. I have been the commanding officer of this vessel for 6 years, and I have, in those 6 years, come to count her as a member of my household. She is sound in hull, sound in machinery, sound in spirit. The Pacific County tax bill that will be tendered, when you find this, will be approximately the amount I am leaving here. Which is $1,300 in cash, the entirety of Margaret's and the boy's inheritance, set aside in a separate envelope in case I die aboard and in case this room, in case this drawer. In case any of it, is ever found by someone with the patience and the vision to find value in what everyone else has abandoned. * The second page told the rest of it. Elmer R. Voss had lost his wife and his son, the boy 8 years old, to influenza in the winter of 1957, 6 months before he had been given command of the Heron. He had not remarried. He had not been transferred ashore. He had stayed aboard, on the Navy's sufferance, for 6 years, and when the Navy had decommissioned the boat in 1965 he had, with the small sum of Margaret's and the boys' money behind him, transferred the back taxes into his name and bought the boat out of Navy custody for the price of the back taxes, on a Tuesday in October of 1965. Signing the same kind of deed Vivian herself had just signed, in the same Quonset hut, sitting at the same counter, 13 years later. He had committed suicide aboard the boat on the night of the final entry of his logbook, by a method the letter did not specify, and his body had been found by the sheriff a week later. And the sheriff had sealed the boat and the sea cabin had been sealed along with it, and the county had tried, for years running, to rid itself of the boat by selling it for the back taxes. And 4 years running no one had bid, because no one could see what the boat was or what she could be made to be made. The third page was the bequest. To whoever finds this, $1,300 was the entirety of what remained of Margaret's and the boys' inheritance, and it was to be spent, the letter asked, in service of the boat. And was to be the lever by which the boat might, in the end, come home. You are the third or fourth bidder in 13 years, Voss had written. * You are the first one to find this room. You have, by finding it, accepted the bequest. There is no other condition. Vivian closed the letter and sat on the settee with both hands in her lap. She set the brass compass, on its handkerchief, on the green baize desk, beside the gold ring on its black velvet. She set the gold ring beside the compass and let herself look at both of them, side by side, for the first time in 13 years and the first time in 15, the two of them on the same desk top. One the size of a milk bottle cap and the other the size of a wedding band. The brass compass scratched with 13 years of being carried in her coat pocket and the gold ring set by 13 years of being held in a drawer in a sealed room in a sealed boat in a closed town. One was a guide to what to measure, she said, out loud, to the empty cabin, and the other was a reminder of what to measure it for. She did not say it out of grief. She said it because she had decided, sitting there, that she was going to stay. She made, that night, a plan on the back of an old pay envelope, in her father's cramped hand, with the brass stylus on a square of butcher's paper from the galley. The plan was not a model. The plan was a single sentence written in capital letters: a submarine is a boat, and a boat is a house, and a house with good food and a clean bunk on a stormy coast is a business, she decided. Over the next 4 days, on the precise shape of the business. The shape was this. She would convert the Heron into a small boarding house for working people on the coast, fishermen, loggers, traveling tradesmen. Lighthouse keepers between assignments, a place where a traveler could, for $7 a night, get a clean bunk, a hot meal, a working shower, and a hot meal at 5 o'clock in the morning. She would do this by stages, beginning with the forward torpedo room, which was the most watertight, the most spacious, and the most readily ventilated. She would not, ever, sand her way into debt. She would not, ever, overreach. On the third day, she walked into town with $1,300 in cash in her coat pocket and bought, at the hardware store, the lumber yard, the marine supply shop, and the paint store. The precise materials she had listed on the butcher paper plan: 82 10-foot lengths of 2x6 fir, 42 sheets of half-inch marine plywood, 6 gallons of naval gray paint, 8 gallons of white gloss for the bulkheads, 240 lineal feet of half-round oak trim, a drum of bronze wood screws, a coil of half-inch manila rope, 4 gallons of seam compound, a single salvage diving helmet for the port side deadlight, and a small cast bronze plaque she commissioned at the local foundry for the bow of the sail. The cost was $1,122. She paid cash. Earl Haskins, at the hardware store, had not called her ma'am once during the transaction. He had called her Miss Marsh. She had, in the single afternoon, crossed the small invisible line in Grey Harbor from being a fool who had bought a boat into being a person who was doing a job. The first project took 28 days. It was the weatherproofing of the forward torpedo room, the largest single space on the boat and the most vulnerable to the Pacific winter. She rebedded the 8 torpedo tube shutters with a half-inch rope of manila caulked-in seam compound. She scraped and repainted all 40 square feet of internal bulkhead. She relayed 300 square feet of teak grating on the deck with the original teak, resawn from the original stock at the local mill. She reamed out 4 of the 12 ballast tank vents that opened into the space and wired each vent with a screened brass screen against the salt. She installed a single cast-iron wood-burning stove. Salvaged from the wreck of the Stickle at the Bremerton Navy Yard by a diver she had paid $40 out of the leftover $278 and who had delivered it. Balanced on a flatbed, on the morning of the 20th day. The work brought people. On the 11th day, an older welder named Tom Kepler came down to the beach at 7 in the morning because Earl Haskins had told him that the girl who had bought the Folly had burned through the rust on the port ballast tank and had asked, in her quiet way, if he would teach her how to do the starboard tank by herself. Tom Kepler was 58, slightly stooped, with hands the size of dinner plates, and he had not been inside a submarine since the Stickle in 1959. He came down about the ballast tanks. He tested her by asking her, first, what kind of metal the tank plate was, and she answered, HY 80 high-yield steel, half-inch rolled, welded to the upper stiffener, and he had not, after that, asked her anything technical again. He watched her work for 3 mornings. He worked alongside her for the next 3. Then one Saturday afternoon, when she had stopped for water, he set down his stinger, took out a tobacco tin, and said, "You hold a stinger like your father held one, Miss Marsh," she asked, briefly. How he had known her father. He taught the welding course at the Bremerton Yard, Tom Kepler said, and offered no other explanation. He came 3 times a week for the next 2 years. On the 19th day, Marlene Dossett, the baker at Marlene's Bakery on the main street, had begun at some unspecified point to leave, on the railing of the forward gangway at 7 in the morning. A small brown paper bag containing a quarter loaf of warm bread, 2 boiled eggs, a slice of her own bacon, and a small bottle of milk with the cream not quite skimmed. She had never, in the first 19 days, made her presence known on the gangway, nor had she ever, in 19 days, asked for money. Vivian had, on the 20th morning, set 7 folded dollars on the railing in exchange for the bag, and Marlene Dossett had, in her own quiet way, not refused the dollars, but had, on the 21st morning, increased the size of the bag by 1 boiled egg, without comment. On the 31st day, a younger man named Russell Cole, 26, who had grown up in Grey Harbor and worked at the Coast Guard station as an electrician's mate, had walked aboard unannounced at 6:12 in the evening while Vivian was wiring the control panels for the auxiliary generator, and had, without saying anything, opened a junction box she had been working around for 3 days, identified a short in the line, and closed it in 11 minutes. She had asked him, briefly, if he wanted to be paid, and he had answered, briefly, not tonight. Russell Cole became, over the next 18 months, her closest working collaborator. A quiet man with red hair and a sailor's habit of patience, who would work on a single junction for 3 evenings and then, on the 4th, walk through a wall of wiring and emerge on the other side having fixed 7 things that had not, in any obvious sense, been broken. These were not what most people, in most places, would call friendships. These were, in their quiet way, a community built through shared work, and Vivian understood, in the days that she had earned nothing in Grey Harbor except the privilege of being part of a thing that was being built. The months turned into a season, the season into a year, and the Heron, on the shale spit west of Grey Harbor, became a different kind of object. The rust had been scraped and primed and painted with the naval gray to which her hull had been returned, and the sail bore, in small bronze letters on the cast plaque from the local foundry, the name * the Heron House, Vivian Marsh, proprietor, EST. 1978, * the forward torpedo room had become the parlor and dining room, the bunks the bedrooms, the mess the kitchen, the control room the front desk and lobby, the radio shack the office. The boat had been given a sign license from the state, a fire inspection, a sanitation inspection, and a small article in the Asterian with the headline. Submarine and anchors Grey Harbor. Vivian had, by the second winter, earned from the people of Grey Harbor the title Miss Heron, a name that materialized, without her permission. On the front of the dockmaster's ledger and in the columns of the Coast Guard station, and that she had not, in any of the 312 days of its silent adoption, ever asked them to stop using. The first guests had been, in November of 1978, for traveling geologists on contract to the Federal Flood Control Authority, who had stayed 3 nights for $7 each and had written, when they left, a short note to the county saying that the Heron House was the cleanest, the warmest, and the quietest accommodation they had stayed in on the Pacific coast in 20 years. The second round of guests had been, in January of 1979, an elderly retired submariner named Chief Yeoman Petty Officer Eugene Hardin, who had served aboard the Pickerel in 1954 and who had stood on the dock outside the forward gangway for 37 minutes before he had walked up the gangway because, he explained later, he did not want to step aboard a submarine he had not served on without permission. He had stayed 4 nights and had left, on the desk in the office, a folded note to Vivian Marsh, in a careful hand, that read, *Welcome home. Sister, The third round of guests was a single traveling machinist who turned out, on the third morning, to have known Tom Kepler at Bremerton in the 1960s, and on the fourth morning had worked alongside Tom, on the starboard tank of his old boat in 1967, and on the fifth morning had laughed, in the dining room, the first laugh Vivian had heard in the dining room in 2 years. A day at the Heron House ran, by the second spring, in the shape of a tide. At 5:12 in the morning, Vivian climbed out of the chief petty officer's stateroom, where she still kept her own small books, brass compass, and the gold wedding ring of Elmer R. Voss in a locked drawer in the fold-down desk, and walked aft to the galley. Russell Cole arrived at 5:40 on his bicycle, the chain clicking on the third pedal. Marlene Dossett's brown bag arrived on the gangway at 6 by her 12-year-old nephew Oscar, who collected a folded dollar with the small formality of a man 10 times his age. Tom Kepler arrived at 7:30, with his stinger in one hand and a tin of tobacco in the other. The day was then a long day, with the guests at breakfast, the guests at dinner, the small routine maintenance, the tour that Vivian gave once a week to the local school children, who asked her questions about the engines and were answered by her, patiently, with bolts and levers held up at eye level. The children of Grey Harbor, 26 of them by the spring of 1980, knew the sound of the brass dogging wheels turning the length of the watertight doors. And they knew that whoever they were visiting under the Heron House they could speak to a person who knew, and who would, at the appropriate moment, give them the appropriate piece of her father's trade knowledge and tell them, in her father's exact words, that the difference between a boat that came home and a boat that did not was the difference between an unsealed seam and a sealed one. The Heron House was, by the third summer, the social and economic heart of Grey Harbor, not because Vivian had made it so, but because the things of Grey Harbor had. To the last child and the last fisherman and the last widow, drifted and toward it as water drifts toward a keel. The town, which had been a population of 219 in March of 1978, was a population of 311 by August of 1980, and the population had, by virtue of the Heron House and the lighthouse keepers and the loggers and the small band of marine draftsmen who had moved into the empty houses on the riverbed, a working economy for the first time in 19 years. Earl Haskins, at the hardware store, was buying inventory twice a year where he had been buying it quarterly. Marlene Dossett was baking 3 extra loaves a day, every day. Russell Cole had been given a small cabin at the Heron House rent-free in exchange for full-time maintenance. Tom Kepler had been given a small bronze plaque of his own, on the port main engine flat, that read T.M. Kepler, machinist, USN, RET. The boat, in other words, had been woken up. On a quiet evening in October of 1981, 3.5 years after she had walked down Seaview Avenue with a brown grocery bag and a brass compass, Vivian Marsh sat alone in the commanding officer's sea cabin, the brass lamp with the green shade turned low, the forward deadlight cracked open to the salt evening. The wind in the sail outside sounding, as it always sounded, like paper. The forward torpedo room and the radio shack were dark. The boat was quiet, the guests all ashore. Russell Cole had gone to town for dinner. Tom Kepler had gone to town for the night. She sat on the green baize settee with her hands folded in her lap. On the fold-down desk, in front of her, two small objects lay side by side, undisturbed since the afternoon 3 years before when she had placed them there and let herself, in her own quiet way, decide. The brass engineer's compass in its leather case, scratched with 15 years of being carried in her father's coat pocket and 13 years of being carried in her own. The lid inscribed in her father's cramped hand, measure twice, the sea forgives nothing, the gold wedding ring of Elmer R. Voss on a small square of black velvet, the ring set 13 years ago and held 13 years in a drawer in a sealed compartment, the ring that had belonged to the captain of a boat that had, in the end, become her house. She thought, briefly, and without bitterness, about the man who had given her $1,873 to leave his kitchen, on a Wednesday evening in March. He had been correct, in his own ledger, that the second bedroom would be needed for the married couple. And that a daughter preparing for a wedding had a different set of requirements than the niece who had lived in that bedroom for 13 years. He had also, in his own ledger, been correct that a sum of money in a young woman's hand was the same as a problem solved and a chapter closed. He had been correct on the day he had said so, and correct on the day he had mailed the check, and correct in his own way forever. He had not, however, in his ledger, been able to imagine that the small sum he had paid her to be gone would be the same small sum, 3 years later. On a postage stamp and a clerk's receipt and a tally of 13 years of back taxes, that had woken up a 312-foot warship on a dead coast, given 311 people a working economy, reintroduced 24 children to the patient exactness of a draftsman's compass, and changed the way an entire small town in the state of Oregon understood what a wreck could be. He had not been able to imagine that, because he was not the kind of man who imagined things of ledgers. He had simply, on a Wednesday, closed his ledger, and moved on. Vivian Marsh sat for a moment longer, in the green light of the brass lamp, in the boat her father had worked on and the captain before her had died on and she herself had woken up. And she placed her hand, lightly, on the leather case of the compass, and she did not move it. It was the best $1,873 she ever spent. It had bought her more than a wreck. It had bought her a life.